Batman and Mr. Bloom
Attention span test.
Mr. Bloom is one of the most dangerous Batman villains of all time, and this is his entire storyline from the New 52 from start to finish. The entire population of Gotham City was absolutely devastated when finding out that Batman had actually died during his battle with the Joker in the city's underground cave system. So they tried honoring his countless acts of heroism to the best of their ability by setting up a citywide memorial service. But at the end of the day, it still felt like there was something missing and like the city would never recover from his sudden absence. Whether they liked it or not though, eventually they'd have to try moving on and seeing if progress without the Caped Crusader was even possible. But that was easier said than done, especially since his death was plastered all over the local news throughout the following weeks, with anchors constantly reminding them of how much safer the city felt back when he was still alive. However, there was one thing about the Dark Knight's death that the citizens definitely agreed was for the greater good, which was that he wasn't the only one to die in the caves because the Joker met his fate as well, right by his side. Nevertheless, as time continued passing, it only grew more and more apparent that the city still needed a Batman even if it wasn't gonna be the original. So after acquiring Wayne Enterprises, the CEO of Powers International, known as Jerry Powers, utilized a vast multitude of her resources to create a super advanced robotic version of Batman that would work alongside Gotham's police force and also with local governments. And you'd think that they'd incorporate artificial intelligence into the suit so it could operate on its own, but instead they concluded it was best that someone was piloting it like a Batman mech suit, which meant that they needed someone who was not only up for the challenge, but who could also harness the same passion and drive that Batman did when it came to serving the people of Gotham. So they started training potential candidates in the GCPD to see who had the most potential, but somehow they ended up settling on someone who didn't even want to be Batman. And you may be asking yourself, who the heck is this guy? Well, I'll answer that question in just a few short moments, but the reason they didn't want the job was because in addition to not feeling like a worthy candidate, they couldn't help but feel like they were disrespecting Batman's mantle. Everything they wanted him to do was so out of character and different from the original Batman. Batman didn't work with the police and waltz around like some sort of public figure. He worked by himself and in the shadows, and they weren't exactly fond of the suit either. But after observing the other candidates, Jerry couldn't help but feel dissatisfied and like none of them were the right pick to fill Batman's shoes. This guy, on the other hand, was different because he knew the city like the back of his hand. And even though some of the other candidates were faster, smarter, and just overall more qualified, there was something about this guy that made her feel like she could go to sleep at night knowing that the city was safe. And that's because he was none other than Gotham City's very own police commissioner, Jim Gordon. And yeah, he looks a lot different than what we're used to him looking like, but buzzing all your facial hair and constantly working out will do that to you. When Commissioner Gordon was selected to be the new Batman, his first mission out in the field was stopping a giant energy monster from breaking into a local bank. But it soon became clear that it wasn't gonna be an easy task because after being thrown around the city like a rag doll, he realized that the beast was completely unfazed by his suit's EMP blasts. However, that's when he was hit by another realization that what he was fighting was just a projection and that it had to have been being controlled by someone nearby. Someone who was probably just creating a distraction because most of the cash in the bank they were attacking was easily traceable. So Gordon started running throughout the neighborhood, frantically scanning everything he could, where he eventually discovered an infamous criminal known as Precious Precious holding Dodger Valera, the most famous baseball player in Gotham history, hostage while also wearing goggles that allowed him to control the monster. And the reason he was holding Dodger hostage was because on top of being a millionaire, he also had a huge stash full of trophies and rings from his illustrious career. However, upon trying to save his life, Gordon was stopped in his tracks almost immediately when the hulking beast smashed him into the ground by launching a massive box truck into the air. But thankfully, Gordon was only out for the count temporarily, and sooner than later he was able to slip out of his mech suit, find his way into Dodger's complex, and then neutralize the target with an electric batarang gun. Here's where things get weird though, because shortly after being taken into custody, Precious mysteriously passed away, and according to the city's new commissioner, it was because of a seed implanted in his leg that was capable of giving people powers, but also it looked as if whoever gave him the seed was able to trigger it to disperse massive amounts of radiation to kill the user and avoid being caught. Anyways, a few days later, the department deployed Commissioner Gordon into another battle with a man named Gigi Hume. the leader of the Chinese mafia who was now somehow capable of earthbending, and Gordon was able to prevail despite facing someone with such powerful capabilities because after they turned themselves into a giant bat rock monster, he used his bat truck to smash them into pieces. But upon his victory, Gordon realized that Gigi was in danger because he had the same exact kind of seed in his leg that Precious did. So he tried stressing that they needed to get him to the hospital, but before being able to do so, he was killed by radiation poisoning right after mentioning that someone named Mr. Bloom was dealing these seeds. So Gordon went back to the drawing board trying to piece this whole seed puzzle together, but eventually he knew he'd only get to the bottom of this by finding someone who could reprogram his mech suit, which would allow him to do some investigating as Batman unmonitored by the GCPD. So he found this guy that was volunteering at a local school who was very experienced with Wayne tech, which then reveals to all of us that none other than Bruce Wayne himself was still alive. Batman's plot armor is so powerful that he even managed to beat death itself, because in the final act of Batman Endgame, it genuinely seemed like he died and like the city of Gotham would actually have to move on without him. But somehow, some way, we find him volunteering at a local rec center trying to help kids recover from the trauma caused by the Joker. And thanks to a new love interest working by his side known as Julie Madison, it genuinely seemed like Bruce was happy for the first time in a long time. But let's stop avoiding the elephant in the room, because I'm sure you guys are asking how this was even possible. Well, this version of Bruce isn't exactly the Bruce we all know and love. And we know that because eventually our story shifts things over to Alfred and Clark Kent leaving the facility Bruce was volunteering at, with Clark feeling like he just lost his best friend, expressing that even though he could see Bruce, he just didn't seem like the person he used to know, before asking Alfred if he could explain what happened to him. So they drove back to the Batcave, where Alfred started from the night Bruce's body was discovered by his daughter Julia, stating that he was on his way to go pick up his body when something truly impossible happened. As his daughter Julia was zipping him up in a body bag, somehow he just woke up like nothing ever happened. And it was all because of Dionysium, the same compound that gave Joker a crazy healing factor during his last big scheme. At one point or another, as the caves were falling apart, some of the Dionysium seeped into his broken skull and healed him even though he had already been dead for a few hours at that point. But in doing so, it brought him back a new person who had zero recollection of his past life. And even though Alfred did eventually inform him of what his past life consisted of, Bruce stopped him from revealing any more details right before he could tell him about Batman, indicating that he needed to leave his past behind so he could create his own journey. So at this point in the story, he still has no idea that he used to be Batman. And seeing how happy he was with Julie and how passionate he became about helping out at the rec center, Alfred eventually came to the decision that he was never gonna tell him about Batman, especially after seeing how obsessed with the mission Bruce was getting before his death, because apparently he was in the process of creating a machine that would use his DNA to create new versions of himself in the future to ensure that the world would always have a Batman. Now, Clark, on the other hand, wanted to tell Bruce about Batman because of how positively impactful he was to the world, but Alfred was opposed because he just wanted his son to be happy for once, threatening Clark with a kryptonite ring and expressing how terrible of an idea that'd be because since Bruce lost his memory, every bit of his training and experience from the last 15 years was completely gone. Bruce Wayne didn't want to help Jim Gordon be a better Batman. You see, after the discovery of Mr. Bloom's seeds, Jim Gordon took them to the recently reborn Bruce Wayne, telling him that they needed to find the person responsible for dealing them because if they didn't get it off the street, soon enough more people were gonna get hurt and more bad people were gonna start having powers. Unfortunately though, the investigative work that Jim needed to do was strictly prohibited by the GCPD, and he was only able to use the suit while on the clock. So he was wondering if Bruce could do him a favor by reprogramming the suit so they weren't able to monitor him. However, Bruce just wanted to leave that life in the past, and as a result of losing his memory, he probably couldn't help Jim even if he wanted to, stating that he wasn't the person he used to be anymore and that he was happy with his new life helping kids at the rec center. So eventually Jim was left with no other choice but to investigate without his armored suit, and even though he could use his regular suit, he still had to limit his use of its abilities because if he used too much power, it would alert the GCPD. Anyways, a gang regarded as the Devil Pigs were his first investigative priority, because he was certain they had been doing business with Mr. Bloom since Gigi Hune, a member of the Devil Pigs and the guy who died in the last issue, had a seed implanted in his leg. But after discovering a massive aquarium filled with sharks in their warehouse, things got real ugly real fast, with practically every one of the gang members surrounding him with machine guns, threatening to end his life. So Jim was forced to dive behind some nearby equipment where he defended himself with an electric batarang gun just long enough for somebody to accidentally shoot the shark tank, resulting in all the members being taken down and one of them actually being eaten by a shark. Moments later though, while analyzing the crime scene, Jim realized that this battle had only just begun, because the leader of the Devil Pigs managed to slip away and capitalize on his unawareness, activating a trap door right under Jim's feet that led to a fiery furnace that's temperature was continuously getting hotter. Our story then shifts things over to our first introduction of Mr. Bloom himself in the midst of Oswald Cobblepot trying to buy some of his seeds so he could sell them on the streets of Gotham. But according to Bloom, Penguin had it all wrong. He couldn't sell the seeds to just anybody because each one of them was personalized to work with one specific user's biology. Not fond of being told what he could and couldn't do though, Penguin then signaled one of his men to pull out his sidearm and blast Bloom directly in the face. Soon enough though, they realized that they weren't messing with just anybody, because as they walked away from the scene, giant spikes were suddenly jammed through all of their abdomens, which were actually fingers of the now fully transformed Mr. Bloom. Batman was almost burned alive by an Asian street gang. After sneaking into the Devil Pigs warehouse, Batman was dropped into a fiery furnace when the leader of the gang activated a trap door underneath his feet. And even though his suit was able to withstand temperatures of around 1000 degrees Fahrenheit, it didn't matter because the furnace was headed towards a whopping 1400 degrees Fahrenheit, which is literally cremation level. Thankfully, before that could happen though, Batman realized that the furnace's coolant coils were exposed, which allowed him an opportunity to use his batarangs to bust them open. And after hitting his target, he crawled out of the pit that almost ended his life, only to discover that the Devil Pigs had regained consciousness from their exchange earlier. So yet again, he was forced into another showdown with them, but due to the furnace draining all his energy and the fact that there was just so many of them, he eventually found himself at the bottom of a dog pile being stabbed over and over again by two large knives. However, despite the odds being nowhere near in his favor, moments later the tables were drastically turned when his armored batsuit came crashing in through the warehouse skylight thanks to his friends at the GCPD activating in autopilot mode. So the Devil Pigs did everything they could to try stopping it in its path, even using an RPG, but the batsuit not only deflected the shot with a missile of its own, but picked up the sharks from the aquarium earlier before using them as blunt objects to temporarily whack the pigs out of the fight, giving it a short window of opportunity to scoop Jim into its cockpit and evacuate the scene expeditiously. Meanwhile, Bruce was still at the rec center, analyzing some of the wreckage left behind from the Joker's last attack, because apparently the city decided to dump it all in the empty lot next door until figuring out a more permanent solution. And Bruce wasn't a big fan of this, because he felt like it constantly reminded the kids of such a horrible tragedy. And as days continued passing, with the city refusing to take care of it, Bruce eventually grew so sick of the mess that he turned a negative into a positive by turning everything into a new playground, stating that they didn't have to be ugly reminders, but testaments to what the kids had persevered through. Anyways, after Jim's private investigation turned into a giant blood-filled mess, he was called into a one-on-one meeting where Jerry expressed her disappointment, indicating that he was being fired and that she wanted him to officially resign during a presentation in front of the city that night. But by the time the presentation rolled around, things didn't go as she intended in the slightest, because right when she was gonna bring him onto the stage, Jim noticed a suspicious aircraft heading towards the event at full speed. So he dove onto the stage, tackled Jerry onto the ground to save her from certain death, only for none other than Mr. Bloom himself to exit the aircraft moments later before killing a countless number of civilians by jamming his fingers through their bodies. Mr. Bloom slaughtered innocent civilians right in front of Batman. And unfortunately, there was nothing Batman could do about it at first, because if he wanted to save as many people as possible, he needed to stay under Bloom's radar until he could catch him by surprise. So Bloom was able to walk around the event, killing people left and right, while stating that he didn't understand what all the panic was about, because he was only there to celebrate everybody's hard work. Because thanks to them being the fertilizer of this great city, it allowed for creations like him to prosper and grow. However, moments later, before being able to harm another innocent, his psychotic little rant was put to a stop when Jerry Powers stood out from the crowd, demanding to know what he really wanted. But Bloom stressed that he didn't want anything from anybody, claiming he only wanted to encourage them to keep doing what they were already doing before pulling some money out of his pocket, dangling it in Jerry's face, and insisting he contribute to the fundraiser. But because Jerry rejected his clearly mockful offering, he then asked that she give it to Batman, but unbeknownst Unbeknownst to him though, Batman was right behind him and had found his window of opportunity, blasting him in the head with multiple batarangs before attempting to knock him to the ground by jumping on his back. But despite being caught off guard, Bloom was completely unfazed and extremely quick to counter the assault, smashing Batman into a nearby wall and then slamming him into the ground before using his fingers to restrain him from moving. So Jim tried answering back by ordering his suit to go after Bloom with voice commands, but before it even got close to succeeding, Bloom effortlessly used the fingers on his other hand to render the suit non-functional before pulling off the bat symbol on its chest to jam it into Jim Gordon. Moments later though, Bloom's little stunt was cut short when Alfred's daughter Julia used the GCPD's Batship, because the way the ship held the mech suit was with super strong magnets, and using those same magnets, she was able to absorb Bloom onto the surface of the ship thanks to his seeds being electromagnetic. However, when it was all said and done, this method only proved to be temporarily effective because soon enough, using his ability to shift and grow his body, Bloom was able to escape confinement and evacuate the scene. A few days later, Jim got called into another meeting with Jerry where she presented an entire army of Batman mech suits, including one that was multiple stories tall. The reason being that they had pinpointed Bloom's hideout and wanted to raid the location without taking any chances. But for some reason, Jim had a feeling that Bloom was setting up a trap and knew that they knew where he was hiding. So he convinced Jerry to give him one last shot to take him down alone using a blocker that would disable his powers. And if he failed, she could fire him without retaliation. And it turns out that Jim hit the nail directly on the head, because when he eventually made his way onto the scene, Bloom was able to take full control of his mech suit and turn it against him. After Mr. Bloom took full control over Batman's mech suit, he forced it to grab him by the neck and choke the life out of him until getting even more brutal by commanding it to launch him into the air with so much strength that he went flying through the roof of the building, headed towards blades of a local news chopper. So with an extremely fast pounding heart, Jim was forced to think quicker than he ever thought before, immediately pulling a hook line out of his suit to begin heading back to the warehouse by using it to pierce through the roof. And while he had hoped for something soft like flowers to help break his fall, the only things waiting to greet him were crates of Bloom's power seeds. Thankfully, they were just soft enough to keep him alive though. But moments later, the injuries he obtained became the least of his worries, because once again his suit started speeding his way to try slamming him onto the floor. This left Jim with no other choice than to latch onto one of the missile gates on the suit's shoulder so he could use the contractors in his gloves to force the suit to self-implode. He then picked the helmet up off the floor, trying to neutralize Bloom's unnatural capabilities by initiating the blocker, but just moments later he was caught off guard when Bloom crushed him onto the ground after altering the size of his foot, before stating that Jim had no idea what he was up against and that soon the entire city of Gotham would be regrown with brand new seeds. But while gesturing Bloom to look at his pile of seeds, Jim assured him that that wouldn't be the case, indicating that when he crashed back into the warehouse earlier, he ignited a silent charge that completely destroyed them. So even if Bloom killed him right now, he wouldn't care, because at least he'd go down knowing that his plans were foiled. And of course, Bloom wasn't too happy about this, so he lifted his hand in the air, suggesting he would finally make the killing blow, only for the helmet's power blocker to finally finish activating, which completely neutralized his abilities, allowing Jim to send his body smashing through a nearby window before taking him into custody. Despite things seemingly shifting in a positive direction though, in the midst of being taken to Arkham as Jim tried removing his mask, Bloom expressed that things were about to take a turn because he had already anticipated for something like this to happen, which is when an entire Bloom army arrived onto the scene, pounding through the roof of the Bat Truck, sending it crashing off course and then helping Bloom escape captivity. Bruce, on the other hand, was also fighting a battle of his own after a strange encounter with Duke Thomas. He already expressed feeling empty and like something was missing to his girlfriend Julie, but after seeing a giant bat in Gotham subway, he was more curious than ever about who he was in the past. So he went to the park where he first awoke after his accident in the caves, which was something he'd been doing frequently lately. But this time he exchanged paths with another man who claimed that he had also been in an accident in the same exact location. What if Batman and the Joker were just normal guys conversating at a Gotham park? Well, after their seemingly fatal battle during the Batman in-game storyline, it's eventually revealed that not only did Bruce Wayne survive the showdown, but the Joker survived as well. However, due to the fact that they both lost their memories and didn't really know what their past lives consisted of, Bruce didn't have any idea who the Joker was, and the Joker only knew that Bruce was Bruce, which resulted in a pretty casual conversation about the state of Gotham City. But soon enough, after an unsettling turn of events, Bruce was put on high alert when the Joker casually pulled out a firearm from a paper bag. Despite the alarming and seemingly hostile gesture though, the Joker claimed he was only trying to make a point, indicating that he was one of the last people rescued in the aftermath of the Joker's attack, and that somehow the incident completely changed him. He no longer had any recollection of who he was in the past, and at first he felt like starting his life all over again was pointless. So he came to this exact park bench with the purpose of inserting the barrel in his mouth and taking his own life. But right before pulling the trigger, he felt like the park bench itself was telling him not to do it, which is when he realized how lovely, peaceful, and calm the area was. It just seemed like a place where a gun shouldn't be fired. So he started to go there every single day to restrain him from hurting himself, and ever since then, his life turned around for the better. He found a stable job at a local butcher shop, moved into a new apartment, and just felt happier overall, which is one of the reasons he was so happy to run into Bruce right now, because it seemed like he was happier as well. And if that was truly the case, then there was no point to dwelling on the past and becoming who he was before. Despite such a harmless suggestion though, Bruce thought that there were deeper intentions behind the Joker's words, because after a recent exchange with Duke Thomas where he had a vision of a giant bat creature, he was starting to believe that he used to be Batman, but he wasn't 100% certain. So he grabbed the Joker by his collar and then pulled him up to his chest, demanding to know how he knew who he used to be. But the Joker swore that he didn't know anything about him except that he was Bruce Wayne, stressing that he could stop things from going back to the way they used to be. And of course Bruce was confused with what he meant by that, so the Joker expressed that because he was head of Wayne Enterprises, he had the power to stop the park lake from being polluted and infested like it used to be in the past. So Bruce finally calmed down after realizing they were talking about two completely different things, but expressed that he wasn't head of Wayne Enterprises anymore, so he couldn't do anything to stop the lake from reverting. However, that's when a massive explosion went off inside the city, and wanting to make sure that his girlfriend and kids at the rec center were okay, Bruce began running their way as fast as he possibly could. After Bruce Wayne unknowingly had a conversation with the Joker, he ran over to the rec center to make sure his girlfriend and the kids were okay after a massive explosion was triggered within the city by Mr. Bloom. And even though nobody was hurt when he arrived, he was confident that somebody was gonna get hurt if they didn't take the kids somewhere safer, because upon escaping captivity while being transferred over to Arkham Asylum, Mr. Bloom revealed that he planted thousands of his power seeds all over the city for anybody to grab, which resulted in the streets erupting into chaos as the citizens of Gotham tried getting their hands on them. But before they could make any progress at all, Bruce realized that the rec center had already been affected when one of the kids there named Liv slowly entered the room bleeding from her arm, revealing that she had taken one of the seeds in hopes of using the powers it granted to take down Mr. Bloom. But unaware of how gruesome and extreme the effects of the seeds were, her body then began a horrific and unnatural transformation until her eyes started glowing, followed by a loud boom. And at this point in the story, we're unsure if the boom was her body exploding or something else having to do with her powers. Jim Gordon, on the other hand, was also in a dilemma of his own at this time, because while trying to crawl out of the wreckage from the recently destroyed Bat Truck, he was not only confronted by an entire Bloom army, but by Mr. Bloom himself, who proceeded to enlarge the size of his body tenfold before parading Jim around the city streets, telling the people of Gotham City that the politicians, police officers, and other people in power were lying gardeners who were pretending to take care of them while they suffered in silence. So instead of standing around with a false sense that the Batman was protecting them, they should take their destinies into their own hands and stop settling for pennies by finding his hidden power seeds. And as Bloom's army continued terrorizing the city streets, Jim tried telling his fellow Gothamites not to listen to Bloom because he was nothing more than an evil liar, but before he could finish making his case, he was completely silenced when Bloom started forcing his roots into his throat to keep him from speaking. So Jerry Powers, who was watching the chaos unfold on a local news station, then ordered one of her men to deploy every single batsuit they had before things got even more out of hand than they already were. And that's when the story goes over to Alfred Pennyworth, who was also watching the chaos unfold inside Wayne Manor. However, soon enough, his observation was interrupted when somebody started aggressively banging on the door to try and get a hold of him. And Alfred knew exactly who this was and that it could only mean the one thing that he had been trying so hard to prevent. So he refused to open the door and tried acting like he couldn't hear anything, but that's when Bruce smashed his way inside, demanding to be taken to his cave to become the Batman once again. After Bruce Wayne demanded Alfred to show him where his Batcave was, Alfred tried doing everything in his power to convince him that this was a terrible decision, because after watching him destroy his mental and physical health every single night for what seemed like forever, he was happy that Bruce had finally started living for himself for once by settling down with with Julie and leaving his mission in the past. However, despite the fact that Bruce was still suffering from memory loss, there were so many hints and so much evidence implying that he used to be Batman that he couldn't just stand around and do nothing while Bloom continued terrorizing the city. So eventually Alfred revealed where his cave was and then took him to a machine that he made that was embedded with all of his memories because its original purpose was creating Batman clones. But Alfred also claimed that if Bruce tried using it to restore his memory, it would end up killing him because during the simulations he ran with it in the past, every single host died from the shock of trauma he inflicted upon them, which basically meant that Batman was too much for another mind to handle, and those minds were completely empty, so he couldn't imagine what it would do to Bruce's mind since it was already filled with memories. And that wasn't the only problem, because apparently Alfred destroyed the machine's server, so the memories were completely gone now. Nevertheless, Bruce was confident that his past self would be smart enough to create some sort of backup server and eventually discovered a full backup of the memory drives called the Alfred Protocol. So not too long after that, he strapped himself inside to start regaining his past identity, but almost immediately upon Alfred activating the machine, it was more than apparent that his body couldn't handle the massive surges of energy it was dispersing as his vitals continued dropping lower and lower. However, that's when Bruce was struck by the sudden realization that in order for Batman to live, Bruce Wayne needed to die. So Alfred needed to ramp the system's power up even more than he already was until Bruce was fully brain dead, and then run the machine one more time at full strength. But after Alfred had already lost Bruce once to the Joker, asking him to kill the boy he gave his entire life up for was like asking him to do the impossible. So that's when none other than Bruce's girlfriend Julie stepped in, exclaiming that she had always known that he was Batman, and that even though he would lose his memories of their relationship if this procedure worked, she was willing to pull the trigger if it meant the city would regain Batman. So despite being such a hard decision, she ran the system at full power twice exactly as she needed to, and at the very moment that Bruce gained consciousness, he looked over towards Alfred, telling him it was time to go to work. After Bruce Wayne regained all of his memories as Batman, he immediately started preparing for an inevitable exchange with Mr. Bloom by shaving off his beard and then picking out a new suit from the armory in his Batcave. Meanwhile, Jim Gordon was being wheeled over to a helicopter on a stretcher because when Mr. Bloom forced his roots down into his throat earlier, they ended up puncturing his spleen so badly that he needed urgent medical attention because he was losing massive amounts of blood internally. However, before being fully loaded onto the chopper, him and Alfred's daughter Julia were confronted by 4 members of Bloom's army who immediately knocked Julia unconscious by hitting her with an electricity blast before claiming that they were gonna kill Jim Gordon after siphoning all the power from the building. But moments later, they were stopped in their tracks when Batman came raging onto the scene, smashing one of their heads into the bat signal before jumping into the air while slamming a cluster of smoke bombs onto the ground, which allowed him to navigate through the battlefield mostly undetected while taking them down one by one. After that, Jim started believing that the odds were finally back in their favor, expressing that he felt a whole lot better now that Bruce was by his side, but moments later he realized that he had spoken too soon when Bloom opened up a massive energy pulse regarded as a strange star that was feeding on the energy of people who had taken his seeds, and if they didn't shut it down quick enough, it was gonna destroy the entire city. Now, eventually they concluded that Bloom had to have been hosting some sort of master transmitter seed that was siphoning and drawing power from active seeds around the city and then funneling all that power into a collider that was responsible for opening the strange star. So Jim wanted to find something that could amplify the signal of the energy disruptor that was integrated into his mech suit so they could suppress the strange star, but before he could even get started on that, Batman implied that he could handle this one by himself by handcuffing Jim to the helicopter because unless he received medical attention fast, then it wouldn't be long before he was dead. Meanwhile, Bloom's rampage on the city streets only continued to escalate for the worse because after killing a countless number of innocent civilians, he used his ability to manipulate energy to take control of the batsuits that opposed him before using those batsuits to destroy the city even more by making them blast the surrounding buildings. However, that's when a bus that Batman rigged with a batarang came flying onto the scene, crashing into Bloom with so much momentum that he went toppling onto the ground. And upon trying to regain composure by getting back on his feet, he was pinned by a gang of Batman's rope traps before Batman himself smashed his leg directly into his face. But unfortunately, the tables were turned just moments later when all the mech suits that Bloom took control of previously started closing in on Batman, which allowed Bloom to break free. And even after using explosives to put some of the mech suits out of commission, Bruce realized that this nightmare had only just begun when an absolutely gigantic Joker mech suit confronted him immediately after. After Batman was confronted by a giant mechanized Joker suit, the Bloom Bloom's storyline switches things over to Jim Gordon, who after being handcuffed to the helicopter by Bruce earlier, decided that he was still going to help take down Mr. Bloom instead of going to the hospital and receiving medical attention for his injuries. So he made his way back to home base to retrieve his mech suit so he could try amplifying the signal of the power dampener to suppress the strange star by hooking it up to the building's antenna. However, moments later, that was no longer an available option when Bloom made a surprise appearance, revealing that he had already destroyed the antenna. So Jim tried convincing him how dangerous the strange star was and that if it kept on growing, the city would be gone for good. But of course, Bloom just didn't care whatsoever and once again exclaimed how beautiful of a garden Gotham was gonna be before attempting to end Jim's life for good by poking his fingers into the window. But after multiple unsuccessful attempts, thanks to Jim diving out of the way, Bloom was caught off guard by a giant fist to the face because it turns out that Batman not only defeated the giant Joker mech earlier, but then jumped inside the cockpit to pilot the suit himself. But now that the building's antenna was destroyed, Jim needed to find another way to amplify the signal of the power dampener while Batman tried ripping out Bloom's transmitter seed because the strange star was still rapidly increasing in size with each passing moment. However, even after Bruce smashed Bloom's head through an entire building until the building collapsed on top of him, Bloom still managed to get back up on his feet somehow, where he then proceeded to wreak absolute havoc on Bruce's mech suit by stabbing it with one of his fingers, hitting its arm with a massive fire blast, and then jamming even more of his fingers through the suit, which ended up causing a system failure. It's here that the fate of Gotham seemed to be nothing short of doomed, because with Batman no longer capable of fending for himself, Bloom had a perfect opportunity to deliver the killing blow and then stop Jim Gordon from amplifying the signal. But that's when none other than Duke Thomas pummeled Bloom onto the ground with a massive energy beam while piloting a blimp in the sky, giving Bruce a perfect opportunity to destroy Bloom's master transmitter seed, utilizing the I-beams integrated into his mech suit. Despite taking so many devastating blows though, Bloom immediately regained the upper hand after his seed was destroyed by impaling the Batmech with so many roots that it was now completely dysfunctional. And then to top it all off, he sent Duke plummeting towards the streets of Gotham City after destroying the blimp that he was piloting. However, not only was Bruce able to save him from certain death with the use of his grappling gun, but it's then revealed that Jim finally found an amplifier for the power disruptor in his mech suit, which of course was a superconductive bat symbol made out of something called Batmanium, and after pointing it in Bloom's direction, the strange star started getting smaller and smaller as Bloom was slowly sucked inside. And with that, Gotham City was saved once again, in addition to regaining their beloved Batman, and it was all because Jim Gordon stepped up to the plate when the city needed it the most. But sadly, that's when this story comes to an end, but if you want more stories like this in the future, let me know in the comments down below.